Good afternoon. Let us begin with the questions. Question 1. The mastery of the creative potential through will and service, in my opinion, works also in the opposite direction. Am I right? Actually, in order to do something, one must first understand. Therefore, first, the intellect, a mastery of the creative potential. And then the intellect understands the role of will and service in life, and after that, everything works in that direction. But one can start in the opposite order, which stirs up service, but one will anyway have to go to creative potential, because there is no other way to move on. We have a comment. The fundamental mistake of conceptualists is that they see only what they want, what their own raviousness allows them to see. You see, this is not a mistake of conceptualists. It is the foundation of the psychology of any person. Every person sees and understands only what his own raviousness allows. People cannot go beyond the limits of what their own raviousness allows. And until their raviousness changes, nothing will change in their world understanding, in their perception of the world, in their circle of interests. Further on, the comrade continues his question. It is explained by the fact that the day of Svarog is an objective super-global process, and the impact is exerted on society, including for reasons beyond the control of people. Nature exists also in cycles. Each cycle has its own character in everything. Why then, in Indian philosophy, the theme of eras reshapes everything? All sorts of yugas, Kali Yuga in particular, with all the details. But they, the conceptualists, don't think so. You have to live 25,000 years to understand. And this and Zaznobin's response material tells us why the pseudo-jretzes and magi behaved in such a way in reply to the program of St. Andrew the First called. They understood the objectivity of the physics of what was happening. To live 25,000 years, well, please, live. Or if you have lived, share the experience with us. Yes, indeed, in nature everything is cyclical. But if you simply look at what the biological species Homo sapiens is, then the variability of the structure of the psyche as an informational algorithmic system is programmed. And if we talk about why quite a big number of society, if not the majority, in the organization of their psyche continue to be bandalogs throughout the memorable history of the present civilization, then the question is not only about the rhythmics of the sun, the rhythmics of the galaxy, the question comes down to pedagogical culture. And in fact, one can be healthy in winter and summer if one behaves according to the weather. Therefore, as for the opinion of magi, pseudo-jretzes, who behaved in such a way that they did not take responsibility for the course of the global historical process, when it became clear to them what was happening in Palestine, and that the biblical project of enslaving everyone in the name of God had entered a new phase, this is their subjective opinion, conditioned by their raviousness. So if Kali Yuga was coming, it was necessary to build a different pedagogical culture that would allow a person to be human. Because, even if we assume that Svarog's era is an objective super-global process, that it really exists, then it's possible that when Svarog wakes up, you will be held responsible for what you did here while he was sleeping, and you had the opportunity to live differently. Therefore, here, whether we like it or not, all people have subjectivism. Magi have their own subjectivism, the internal predictor, its participants have their own subjectivism, every member of the crowd has his own subjectivism. The only question is, which of these subjectivisms will be supported by the Almighty? Here's a comment. So the seemingly wise Velichko showed his subjectivism like V.M. Zaznobin showed his egocentrism. Why again and again do the conceptualists not indicate the sources from where they took the information? I have already said more than once that all the necessary bibliographic references are given in the thick books. To list the editions, pages, when I say something orally, it's just boring, and this information is not related to the theme. In addition, in a number of cases in the materials of the conception, there are references to resources, conversations that became the heritage of the participants of the internal predictor several decades ago, when the internal predictor wasn't even about to emerge, and therefore the question of remembering bibliographical references just did not arise. For this reason, one should not see malicious intention where it really does not exist. In addition, I have never said, Vladimir Mikhailovich also has never said, and no one involved in the writing of the materials of the conception has ever said that these are impeccable, error-free texts. Yes, in the texts there may be errors of various levels, methodological, stylistic, factological, but people should correlate everything to life as such. Therefore, the errors are not of fundamental importance, provided that people feel life, think for themselves, and correlate the texts with life as such. Comment. It turns out that the conceptualists themselves need to work more and more towards a human type of psyche structure. Yes, everyone needs to work. I have not seen anyone who lives in the light of his own nimbus and warms himself up with his energy. Comment. Why does the internal predictor criticize, in their works, those whose information the internal predictor presents as their own? The last reproach is pure demagoguery. In the materials of the conception, concretely, where, what, from your point of view, is borrowed from someone and is presented as the internal predictor's own. Among other things, I remind everyone once again that the conception does not recognize personal copyright within society, because in the end, if one recognizes personal copyright within society, then by doing so, one builds one's own plagiarism of the Almighty, since He is the creator of creation. He is the creator of all possibilities that are open in creation. So one elevates one's own plagiarism of the Almighty to the rank of one's own copyright. This is, to put it mildly, not good. Question 2. I agree with the presentation of the materials and I support them, but how to convey them to people whose brains are swollen with fat, to those who buy apartments for 2 billion and so on, because they will not listen? Well, some will listen, some will not listen. In addition, the question is not about that 1 or 2% of the country's population who own more than half of the property in this country. The question is about the overwhelming majority of the population, who, in themselves, generates such people. In order for such people not to appear, society itself must change. And maybe not even in the sense that such people should disappear from life, because they, as a social phenomenon of life, will disappear from life not very soon. But it's necessary to make it so that there are enough people who take the position, the state is us, and at the same time they possess pravius nraviousness. And it's necessary to make it so that there appear quite a large number of these people in order to staff the state apparatus and the sphere of governance in the national economy. After that, those who want an apartment for 2 billion, a yacht for 10 billion, for example, just for juxtaposition, the construction cost of an American aircraft carrier is at the level of 13 billion. So someone may want a floating palace the size of an aircraft carrier. So such people should feel uncomfortable in society. And this uncomfortableness should encourage them to either re-upbring themselves or go away somewhere, foreign countries, or self-liquidate out of boredom. Read 2 novels by Ilf and Petrov, 12 Chairs and The Golden Calf. They very well demonstrate that psychology, that nraviousness, which does not allow socialism, communism, to be realized as a society of victorious praviousness for all. Recall the episode when Ostap Ibrahimovich, in a compartment car on a train, is a fellow traveler of college students who are coming back home from apprenticeship. Ostap Ibrahimovich shows them a suitcase full of rubles and immediately finds himself in psychological isolation, until we, society, start to generate corresponding psychological isolation in relation to those who are impravious, who use our energy and knowledge. They will dominate the crowd elite society, because many who are not happy about apartments for 2 billion, they are unhappy only because these apartments are not their own. Question 3. Let me ask a question not according to the essence. Please tell me, if you turn to God in the form of a request, in order to get an answer, is the mood tuning important during the prayer? And can one ask for something for other people in a prayer? For example, to get a prompt on how to prompt or nudge a person towards the resolution of his problem. You see, of course it's better if you are in the right mood tuning. But the Almighty is lenient. And if we talk about prayer, there is only one requirement for it: sincerity, without falsehood, without hypocrisy. Well, look at the poem by M. Lermontov. Across the dark sky came the angel in flight. There are the following words there. Every phrase unfeigned in that purest of praise. So a prayer, it must be unfeigned. Sincerity is required for this. And everything else is already the circumstances as they are. God is lenient with us. Question 4. If a man is subordinate to a woman on the basis of instincts, then why are there such phenomena as rapes, murders in relation to women? Are such crimes committed by the carriers of demonic psyche structure or vice versa? And tell me please if I understand it correctly that snakes are strongly armed creatures, but unlike lions in the fight for the female, males do not physically harm each other, but they can kill the female. Why does this happen? When I talked about the biology of man, about the innate component of the informational algorithmic support of our behavior, it was in fact about the norm, which manifests itself in the behavior of the main statistical mass. And deviations from the norm are that which is in the tails of distribution. Therefore, deviations from the norm, which is in the tails of distribution, can lead to both rape and murder. But this, nevertheless, in relation to the norm, is a statistically rare phenomenon. As for snakes and other biological species, you know there is also this problem there which I spoke about. Fertility in any biological form exceeds the capacity of the ecological niche. Excessive specimens are destroyed. They are destroyed at different stages, so there may be situations that when the population feels the threat of overpopulation, excessive females can also be destroyed. Question 5. Beforehand the global predictor globalized, and now they are deglobalizing. Were they mistaken, or is this a process? As I understand, you are asking me to comment on what Valery Viktorovich Pyakin said in one of his former programs. You see, if you have questions concerning Valery Viktorovich's programs, then you should contact him. With regard to the activity of the global predictor, in the period from the beginning of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, they lost governance according to the entire function, because the problem, which in Marxism received the name general crisis of capitalism, arose before Marxism appeared. This problem arose immediately after the victory of the first bourgeois democratic revolutions in Europe, and the principle that money governs everything, money is the god of civilization, began to pave its way. Marxism was born as an attempt to solve the problem of the general crisis of capitalism, the unrestrained race in the consumption of socio-cultural means. Marxism as an ideology, on the basis of which a global culture was supposed to be built, did not cope with this task. In many ways, it did not cope with this task thanks to the activity of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, for which they still cannot forgive Stalin. And everything else regarding the repressions that fell on the period of his governance, well, all this would have been justified by the global guise, provided that Stalin would not have buried the Marxist project. But J.V. Stalin buried the Marxist project and thwarted what is called the World Socialist Revolution, a pseudo-socialist one. Therefore, the global predictor, remaining faithful to the principles of building a crowd elite culture on a global scale, are slowly losing governance. And they don't achieve all the things that they want. And they have to improvise. Improvisations also turn out to be not as successful as they would like. They are accompanied by side effects which in fact, in their commonness, in the end, can give rise to two outcomes for the current civilization. Either its collapse, that can be a very hard collapse with destruction of the current biosphere, or the transformation of the entire Earth and the way out to a new quality of being of man. The former two lectures were devoted, in essence, to general principles. The previous one was devoted to culture as such, and the lecture before the previous one was devoted to the innate components of informational algorithmic support of the life of man. General principles are general principles. General objective laws are general objective laws. But life, it is, however, the concreteness of their manifestations. And if we talk about the concreteness of their manifestations, then here is the same picture. 6 groups of objective laws that everyone needs to know in order to understand how to build the life of civilization, how to build the life of one's own society, country, family, and one's own life. And if man as a biological species is a part of the biosphere, then the following question is natural. What impact does the biosphere exert on civilization? And now let's take a look. We live on land, we live in a certain biocenosis, well, in the ideal natural biocenosis, but practically many in Europe and the USA, other developed countries, more than half of humanity, live in conditions of degrading biocenosis of large cities. They are not children of the forest, not children of the steppe, they are children of the asphalt. But if you look into the distant past, where there was no civilization yet, but the biological species already existed, when the catastrophe which destroyed the past global civilization had ended, then what was there in fact? There were populations of people who, after the catastrophe, ran wild and who lived in certain natural geographical conditions, And as a matter of course, the culture formed in these natural geographic conditions. And since the natural geographic conditions in different regions of the planet are different, they also exerted a different impact on people and dictated to them a lot of things which later became the basis of civilization. Because if we evaluate the biosphere simply from the point of view of physics, then the first question is, what is the mass of organic matter in a certain territory? What does this mass depend on? And we get a very simple answer, that the mass of organic matter in a certain territory depends on the amount of water and on the amount of solar energy, primarily solar energy that falls on this territory. The lack of both leads to the fact that the mass of organic matter in a territory tends to zero. The most striking examples are Antarctica, where temperatures are below Celsius all year round, and African deserts, where there seems to be enough sun but there is no water. And accordingly, the mass of organic matter in both places is close to zero. If you look at what is happening in other territories, then somewhere there is more sun, somewhere more water, and under the impact of this combination, the concreteness of certain natural geographical conditions takes shape. This concreteness of natural geographic conditions determines the maximum number of people in these regions, since in order to live, they first of all have to be nourished. And in order to be nourished, there are two variants. Either they gather tops and roots and hunt, or they organize agricultural production, food production which ensures the annual cycle of their life. And they cannot increase the population in an enclosed, in terms of the economy, region more than the productivity of its biocenoses allows. If we turn to antiquity, then the power of Egypt is a consequence of the fact that they collected 2 or 3 harvests in the Nile Valley, and their competitors could not always guarantee even one harvest. Now let's look at what is happening in different regions with physical geographical peculiarity, but on the condition that the level of development of civilization is close to zero. If these are deserts, steppes, then what happens? The productivity of biocenoses is minimal, and accordingly, horticulture, in that form in which it exists, or in some alternative forms, is not able to feed a sufficiently large population. Therefore, it turns out that nomadic cattle breeding becomes the basis of the economy. We trust sheep to eat grass, and then we eat sheep. Yes, this provides food, ensures some kind of primitive life, but the development of crafts that require a settled life, for example, pottery, requires certain clays, requires energy to ensure firing. All crafts based on metallurgy also require metal deposits, require energy to recover metals from oxides, and require energy to ensure technological processes. So the development of such crafts, in the conditions of a nomadic way of life, turns out to be practically impossible. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question is connected with the low productivity of biocenoses. It leads to the fact that in order for the family to be able to be nourished, a certain number of livestock is required. In order for this livestock to be able to reproduce themselves in the continuity of generations, and to ensure the life of the people, certain territories are required. This determines, first of all, the family clan way of life of nomadic peoples. And if, stopping somewhere in the steppe, they see the lights of a neighboring camp, then this is a very tight settlement. If one moves from the steppe zone to the forest zone, then the forest zone is characterized by a different water balance of territories, a greater productivity of biocenoses, a large species diversity of biocenoses. Opportunities open up for a settled way of life, or an episodically nomadic one, when one lives in one place, eats everything around, and in order to live further, one moves to another place and lives there also more or less stably, until one has eaten everything around that place. So, a settled nomadic way of life was also characteristic of people in the forest zone in the era of the so-called slash-and-burn agriculture, when just one part of the forest was cut down, burned, and on this land people were engaged in horticulture for some time until the soil was depleted, and then they moved to another place where the cycle was repeated, and formerly used fields again got covered with forests, and after several centuries it was possible to live there again in the mode of slash-and-burn agriculture. But such work as slash-and-burn agriculture, the whole cycle of work related to it, in fact, is hardly feasible by the efforts of one family. So it turned out that the biocenoses of this zone presupposed a compact communal way of life. Further, If moving to the north, there is again a drop in the productivity of biocenosis, which is no longer conditioned by the lack of water, but by a lack of solar energy. Again, there appears a transition to a nomadic way of life, to a family way of life, and again to cattle breeding, but already domestic animals, not those that live in the steppe zone, but those that can live in the harsh tundra. But nonetheless, the development of civilization required a settled lifestyle and starting conditions as a compact communal life arrangement, which presupposes systematic communication of people with each other. So, societies took shape. Here is a civilized society. Look at this table. Society as an object of governance. Society in the conditions of civilization can be presented as a certain set of social institutions interacting with each other, and each of which carries out certain functions that cannot be performed by other social institutions, cannot be performed by people alone. This gives the definition of a social institution as an intrasocial formation that performs certain functions, and these functions cannot be performed by other social institutions, cannot be performed by people alone. Society is a holistic organism. Therefore, social institutions interact with each other, mutually penetrate into each other, and depending on what social institutions society gives birth to, how they interact with each other, so lives the society. If one looks at life in historically long intervals of time, then to consider social processes, it is enough to consider the interaction of four social institutions: family, statehood, science, and system of education. The table is in principle simple in its construction. Horizontally, we view social institutions as sources of goods. Vertically, in columns, the same social institutions in the same order we consider as recipients of goods provided by the entire commonness of social institutions. What should you pay attention to here? First of all, there is no economy as a social institution. Why? Because the economy is an organizational technological complex plus society. The organizational technological complex is not a social institution because there are no people in it. It has the means of production, natural resources, organizational procedures, structures, certain interconnections, but there are no people in it. People, interacting with organizational technological complex of the national economic complex, generate the economy. But people are, again, the whole society. Therefore, considering the economy as a social institution with this approach is inappropriate. What is more, social institutions and the nature of their interaction in different societies may be different, and the organizational technological complex of different societies may be, well, if not the same, then in many respects close. Look at the history of the Second World War. The USA is one system of interaction of social institutions. The Third Reich is a different system of social institutions and their interactions. The Soviet Union has a peculiarity in the interaction of social institutions. Japan also has a peculiarity in the interaction of social institutions. China has a peculiarity in the interaction of social institutions. And if we turn to the economies of these countries, then the organizational technological complex of each of them is based on the same constructive solutions, the same fundamental science, the same technologies. Yes, there are certain specificities, but nevertheless, if we consider the combat aircraft of all participants in the World War, then these are piston engines of air or water cooling, a glider, either of an all-metal or composite structure. And if you erase the identification marks of the power's owners, then the layman will not understand which of the states this or that plane belonged to. Moreover, there where social institutions existed, and the economy in comparison with other states was not developed, because China is now the leading in terms of economy superpower, which has certain problems with the development of fundamental science. But during the Second World War, it was the economic, organizational, technological backwardness of China that made it a victim of its more successful neighbors in terms of development of techniques and technology. And in this regard, we must recall the Valdai Forum and the assertion of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin that if nuclear war occurs, they will simply die and we will find ourselves in paradise. As for the fact that we will find ourselves in paradise, here I should say, I would not start to delude myself, because if a nuclear war occurs, then we have to give an answer to the reproach expressed by Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy back in the 19th century. Gifting with a generous hand, the King of Heaven gave an order that this enriched by heaven land be strong and hail at every border, but that villages would fall, that the fields would be made empty, the King of heaven, of us all, would hardly give us such a blessing. Therefore, if a nuclear war occurs, a global war occurs, yes, we do not have a doctrine of a preventative strike, we have a conception of a retaliatory strike. Nevertheless, we will have to answer the question, why did we bring the country to such a state that the aggressor came up with the illusion of impunity, and he dared to unleash a global war? Because if we turn to history, then attacking the Soviet Union, Hitler did not at all strive for May the 9th, 1945, in the form in which it's really known from history. He was intoxicated with the illusion that everything would be completed, if not within 2 weeks, then within several months of the summer campaign, reach the Urals, the depths of the Urals, and after that, engage in the colonization of the occupied territories, the regulation of border relations with Japan, which claimed to take Siberia, and the elimination of the excessive, racially inferior, from his point of view, population of the Soviet Union, so that the number of slaves was sufficient to ensure the prosperity of Germany, which he expected. If there had been no illusion of impunity, then there would have been no war. Therefore, the principle, if you want peace, prepare for war, it really works, but behind it there is the interaction of social institutions and their interaction with the organizational technological complex. Therefore, I ask you to draw this table, then draw arrows from it to the organizational technological complex, which you can draw under the table. Then circle it all. The circle will symbolize the biosphere of the planet, and everything else will designate the components of the biospheric social economic system as an object of governance. And the society represented by this table interacts both with the economy, with the biosphere indirectly, through the organizational technological complex of the economy. Now let's take a look at the composition of these social institutions. Here is the family. The main function of the family is the continuation of humanity, the reproduction of the population, the culturally peculiar population. Statehood. If we look at the functions of statehood from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then statehood is a subculture of governance on a professional basis towards affairs of social as a whole significance on the scale of society and localities. It is important here that governance is carried out on a professional basis, and thanks to this, the state can solve those governorial tasks that social self-initiatory organizations and people alone cannot solve. In this regard, one should recall once again the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. The legitimate object of government is to do for the community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do it all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. That is, the definition of government tasks given by Lincoln is quite consistent with how the functions of statehood are understood on the basis of the sufficiently general theory of governance. But Lincoln also made a reservation. You cannot help people permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. This also corresponds to the functions of state power and the delineation of responsibilities of state power and other social institutions. But you also need to understand that the statements of President Lincoln are a certain culture, political culture, and this statement makes it possible to understand why the USA, not in a problem-free way, but on the whole successfully, have been solving all the tasks, all the problems it has faced throughout its history. But if you turn to our political science textbooks, then there is nothing but demagoguery there. On the theme of spirituality, patriotism, statehood, there is nothing there. And the non-determinations that our textbooks give rise to, in conditions of absolute, almost total gnosiological illiteracy of society, that is, when people are not able to produce from scratch and independently master new knowledge at the rate at which the needs arise for it, this explains why we live as we live, and not otherwise. Next, science and the system of education are also social institutions. Please note that we have not included churches and mass media. Why? The answer is simple. The disunity between science and religion is a specific property of biblical civilization. If you turn to the Quran, then all knowledge is from Allah, and it depends only on a person to use it for blago or harm towards other people. In Vedic culture, in Buddhist culture, science and religion are also inextricably linked. But the fact that religion and science are separated and divided up to the point of conflict is a specific feature of biblical civilization. Therefore, as a special case, this is not reflected here, since the norm should be the fact that science and religion are a single complex. And this is not just a single complex, because if you look at the history of ancient civilizations, then in this complex there is also art. Next is the system of education. The mass media can be considered as one of the branches of the system of education, simply due to the fact that the functions of the system of education and the mass media coincide. Their task, both of these and the others, is to provide certain information to people, although they do it in slightly different ways and address different audiences, but nonetheless the tasks are common. Therefore, there are no churches and mass media in this table. They should partly be included in those social institutions that are represented here. And then look how it turns out. If a society is a healthy organism, then all its social institutions, firstly, must perform each of its functions, and perform it at an extremely high level of quality. And in addition, they must interact correctly with each other. And this interaction with each other must also be carried out at an extremely high level of quality. Well, if you look at the deeper layer of what is behind the table representing the social institutions, then behind them, there is human biology, as of the biological species. First of all, this is its genetic program of development, and innate and cultural components of informational algorithmic support. Moreover, the nature of interaction of the social institutions with each other, and the functions of each of them in the concretics of their implementation, that is, the quality of functions performed by them, are determined by the typology of culture that society carries. What type it belongs to according to three characteristic attributes which I spoke about before: relation towards creativity, relation towards human will, and relation towards sovest. Therefore, this picture enables one to very densely pack information that relates to life of society. And, if one thinks, then to unpack this information with any degree of detailedness in the concretics of the interrelationships of all the social institutions with each other, in the concretics of interrelationships of states and regional civilizations with each other. Through it, prospects are also opened, multivariate prospects, both in the absence of governance, that is, everything flows as it flows and we don't interfere in anything, or we interfere during the processes as such and exert a meaningful governorial impact on their course, which can be directed both for blago, that is, for the development of global civilization in the stream of providence, or for evil, that is, for the degradation of civilization, its roll back to the Stone Age, or moving along the path of self-destruction by strength of the fact that the potential of development is not being mastered, and the herd pack monkey, with a low innate morality, under the impact of scientific technological progress and the development of the technosphere, ceases to be a weakly armed biological species, the existence of which in the biosphere of the planet is admissible. Now let us look at the functions of these social institutions in more detail. What does family give to family? Continuation of humanity, direct care for each other of family members, or does not give this in case of violation of its functions in itself. What does family give to statehood? Human resources, nraviousness, ethics, the foundations of the cultural unity of society. They are also embedded in the family. What does family give to science? Human resources, nraviousness, ethics are also the foundations of cultural unity of society. It can be added that the culture of senses and thinking, on the basis of which scientific activity is built, is also laid in the family. And if someone became a great scientist, then this is primarily the merit of the family in which he was conceived, born, and which did not trample on his cognitive creative potential. The family also provides the system of education, with human resources, nraviousness, ethics, the foundations of the cultural unity of society, on the basis of which the system of education works in the future. Further, we move on to statehood. In relation to family, statehood ensures the protection of family and gives rise to factors that condition the quality of life of the family and individual. And if you look at what statehood gives, then in the interrelationship between family and statehood, the following principle has long been known and expressed in one of the Russian proverbs. The people sin, and the people are a collection of families. The Tsar will pray it away. The Tsar sins, no one will pray it away. That is, errors and abuses of state governance cannot be compensated for by the particular initiative of any one of the people, families, any social organizations, if we consider all this in short intervals. But if some social group behaves incorrectly, then its incorrect actions can be compensated, suppressed, eradicated, simply by means of state politics. What does statehood give to statehood? Again, the organization of the system of governance and the reproduction of the culture of governance on a professional basis in the continuity of generations. Statehood gives science, the organization of the system, support to fundamental science, because fundamental science, as it was repeatedly noted in the materials of the conception, is not capable of self-sufficiency on the principles of commercial activity. It definitely needs state funding and the support of its activities by the politics of state power. But there is another subtle circumstance here. Our bureaucrats for some reason believe that the effectiveness of science is determined by the number of publications, citation indices, and nonsense of this kind. The effectiveness of science is not determined by the number of publications, citation indices. It is determined by completely different qualities. Because look at Dmitry Ivanovich Mendeleev, an epoch-making idea, the periodic table. Which of those contemporaries understood that? They did not understand, therefore he was not elected academician. But nevertheless, Mendeleev's periodic law is an epoch-making idea that opened up a lot for the further development of such branches of science as physics and chemistry. And citation indices, for the most part, if we put them at the head of the evaluation of scientific activity, are the stimulation of graphomania and the suppression of science as such. Setting research tasks in the interests of the implementation of politics is also a function of the state. They imply, in a number of cases, a return to the first two functions, organizing a system of scientific research and supporting fundamental science, both with cadres resources and funding, and other resources. Statehood also gives to the system of education, organization of the system, and the setting of educational tasks. The setting of educational tasks is again related to the typology of cultures. What kind of person should we get? A. Fursenko, the Minister of Education, said that the Soviet system tried to make a person creator, but it is necessary to make a qualified consumer. That is, if this is the task of the post-Soviet system of education, then qualified consumers will be creatively impotent, and unqualified consumers, that is, the system's students with the lowest grades, are doomed to be criminals in this case, or they will psychologically break out and take revenge on the rest of the society which was unable to provide an acceptable for them consumption level. In other words, such events as the Columbine High School massacre, they will be repeated with the support of state politics in relation to the system of education. Further, we move on to science. In the family, through the system of popular science books, films, articles, and other publications, science provides the formation of the outlook of the younger generations and adults over and above the obligatory educational minimum accepted in society, and which is provided by the system of popular education. Science provides statehood with scientific methodological support for the current state governance and the development of a political course for the future. The problems of Russia are connected with the fact that science does not provide adequate scientific methodological support for the state governance. To science itself, science gives the reproduction of the subculture of scientific research and the solution of applied tasks. That is, this is the reproduction and formation of new scientific schools. To the system of education, science gives the methodology of cognition and creativity, world understanding. That is, the thematics and content of educational standards, cadres of professional teachers. But here it is also necessary to understand that these two cells of the last line, statehood gives to the system of education and science gives to the system of education, are situated in a certain connection. That is, the state is a censor in relation to what science can give to the system of education and what it really gives, since statehood, its institutions, its subdivisions, allow or do not allow this or that thematics into the content of educational standards, even in spite of the fact that our constitution says something like teaching activity is free in nature. But nonetheless, the state censorship does exist. And if the higher school of economics controls almost all education in the fields of sociology, economics, and finance, and educational programs are filled with nonsense and zombifying tools to ensure the functioning of the liberal market economic model, in accordance with this, the casting of professional teachers is also carried out, that is, their admission, non-admission to teaching. So one should not labor under delusions. We live according to how the scientific methodological support of state governance is provided. Further, the system of education provides the family with a starting level of education and professionalism of new generations entering into life. This is the basis for integrating them into the life of society. And again, if you look at our system of education, then those ideologists of the reforms of the system of education that were carried out in the 1990s are still being carried out to this day. They deserve criminal liability under Article 275 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation that is currently in force, since the beneficiary, as a result of the ongoing reforms, turns out to be anyone but not the population of Russia and not the Russian statehood. The system of education gives statehood the basis for the cultural and political unity of society, or does not give it, and forms a split in society, which creates difficulties in state governance. It also provides statehood with cadres of professionals governors. Well, what kind of cadres it provides? I ask you to watch the video 12 questions that any official should answer, which was conducted with students with the degrees of masters in the faculty, state and municipal governance. The test was a few months before they received their diplomas. In other words, everything is very, very bad. To science, the system of education gives cadres of professionals, researchers, and developers. To the system of education gives cadres of professionals, teachers. So we have finished looking into this table. To the right of it, there is the text. The text can be illustrated by many facts, both of a positive character, that is, when the social institutions functioned correctly, solved their inherent tasks properly, interacted correctly with each other. And this is expressed in a very successful development of society. Well, and you can look at how these same social institutions interact incorrectly with each other, perform their functions incorrectly. As a result, society suffers this or that damage, and in the most severe cases, for example, Byzantium, simply ceased to exist, and societies were replaced by societies carriers of other cultures which integrated into themselves ethnographic material, which turned out to be unable to reproduce a stable and safely developing socially economic system. To put it differently, society, as an object of governance, is, first of all, social institutions and their interaction. If we talk about governance, then yes, somewhere there can be personal addressed, that is, structural governance, but mainly, governance is carried out through culture as an informational algorithmic system, and is predominantly structureless. However, structureless governance can generate structural governance, and structures can purpose-orientedly influence culture as an instrument of structureless governance, generating certain changes in life. And further, we need to look at how the whole thing interacts, and then it becomes clear that the interaction of all these social institutions with each other is of a different character if we consider it at different time intervals. If we consider everything at short intervals of time, well, within 10 years, then statehood undoubtedly dominates over everything. Effective state politics allows to resolve a lot of problems, allows to normalize the activities of all other social institutions, to ensure the reproduction of effective statehood in the continuity of generations. Errors and abuses of state power also impact the social institutions, the character of their interaction with each other, and the character of the economy. Well, if we move on to longer intervals of time, covering periods of several decades, then it turns out that the family institution is the key to all social institutions, because statehood, science, and the system of education, if we consider civilization in its historical development, branched off of the institution of family. Just look, antiquity. One father taught his son a craft, but the crafts were different. Someone taught his son to plow and sow, someone taught his son to fire pots, someone taught to weave, someone taught to melt metal and forge, and someone taught his son how to govern, because he himself was the governor, taught to collect and lead an army, and as a result of all this, some became craftsmen and continued to be peasants, and some became governors. Well, since there was no system of education as a branched away institution, all education was of an intra-family character. History developed for a long time where the principle, from rags to riches, really did not cause anything, except that its realization brought one or another damage to society, because for the most part, a person who received not the right family education could not perform functions in another social group to which his family did not belong. Further, crafts developed, science emerged. The system of education then emerged from science. And so we ended up with the modern set of those social institutions, the interaction of which with each other determines the character of the life of society. Has anything changed if looking at their interactions over historically long intervals of time? Actually, nothing has changed. The family is still the main social institution from which everything grows. Because, indeed, the genetic potential for the development of future generations is embedded in the family. In the family, in the prenatal period, and in the first years of a child's life, the prerequisites are created or suppressed. The prerequisites for the child to realize his genetic program of development in an extremely effective way. And it is the family that determines what will be, whether the child will master the creative potential, whether he will be a carrier of will, whether he will be Dobra Sovestius, or Sovest and shame will egress from the life of his psyche. Therefore, the current statehood can do whatever it wants. What it does is the consequence of past eras of statehood, science, system of education, family. But if we are talking about the future, about the distant future, then all the current eras and eras of the near future that statehood, science, the system of education commit and will commit, all the abuses that will take place in them are nothing compared to what family can do. Because if a family is not oriented towards consumerism, then in fact, it can have many children. It can conceive children previously. Instead of hanging around shopping malls, nightclubs, and traveling to foreign countries, it can be engaged in the upbringing of children. And as a result of this, in about 20 years, several people will come from the family whose creative potential will not have been trampled, whose willpower will be subjugated to the dictatorship of Sovest. And further, if they correspond with these principles, it means that they will be humans in the aspect of the type of psyche structure, and they will enter into bodies of state power, science, the system of education. They will work in the economy. They will have a certain impact on the functioning of the organizational technological complex, its development. And due to the fact that in functional capability, they will surpass those who were unpreviously conceived, unpreviously brought up, received a defective education of a zombifying character, and after some time, all the social institutions will be under their control. Well, you yourselves understand that they will build life differently. They will differently build the interaction of these social institutions with each other. And accordingly, they will be able to realize this very cyclics, which is necessary in the life of society in order for society to live and develop in harmony with the biosphere of the planet, without creating any conflicts of civilization of the biosphere, without creating internal conflicts in society itself. The following picture also contains densely packed information. Model of the objectively necessary cyclics of organization of state governance. The cyclics begins with the first block. Analysis of the state, condition, and tendencies in the biosphere, and demography. In the upper right corner of the picture, the limiter of any civilizational development is the biospherically acceptable structure of land use in the region. This picture appeared for the first time in 1976 in the works of the Greek architect Doxiadis Konstantin Angelovich. According to his estimates, 40% of the territory should be pristine. That is, these are nature reserves, sanctuaries, where people can appear at a certain time only under the control of tour guides, workers of these nature reserves and sanctuaries. 42% of the territory is also nature landscapes, but here people can appear for recreation, collecting of mushrooms, berries, and some other activity. Naturally, industrial activities and garbage dumps cannot exist on these 82% of territory. Our bandalogs are able to foul up anything they reach. In order for society to be able to live normally, according to his estimates, about 10.5% of agricultural land is required. But we must understand that with traditional agriculture, which is based on monoculture, large areas, when they are plowed, expel water from the soil, disrupt the water balance of the territory, and lead to the degradation of biocenoses. In other words, in order for a desert like the Sahara to arise, it is necessary to intensively engage in agriculture, violating these proportions. After that, through the plowed soils, the water goes into the atmosphere, and then the sun shines and the place turns into a desert. 7.3% of the territory is the territory of settlements. It is clear that human life anyway requires the implementation of the principle, the best family is a family of many generations, and in order for the family to live, a plot with some kind of outside area on it is required, where children can communicate with nature, and adults can relax and ensure the family's needs with fresh vegetables and fruits, and a large enough house is also needed, where everyone could be on their own when necessary, and at the same time communicate and help each other. And only 0.2% of the territory is industrial landscapes, where there are no biocenoses, but there are territories where civilization wastes are disposed and recycled. This column chart in each concrete region has its own link with each column to territories, landscapes, and a concrete structure of land use in its physical terms. It either allows to increase the population size, increase the intensity of economic activity, or does not allow, or the increase of the population requires a transition to some other way of life. In particular, one of the problems is the elimination of traditional agriculture of monocultures. The fact is that monocultures, large areas of these monocultures, one of the aspects of harm done by them I have already named is the loss of water by territories, and accordingly in the future, a degradation of the surrounding biocenoses. And the second side of the question is the needs of all sorts of agricultural chemicals, because monocultures are defenseless against pests and everything else. There is an alternative, so-called permaculture. One of the associates of this cause is the Austrian peasant Sepp Holzer. He learned to artificially form biocenoses, which consist of many species of plants, animals, birds, fish and other organisms. These artificially formed biocenoses have a higher productive feedback than traditional agriculture, both per unit area and per person employed. In particular, in the conditions of Austria, as Sepp Holzer said in his speech at the Agrarian University of St. Petersburg, he pays taxes 10 times more than his neighbors, and the development of permaculture as a basis of agriculture, in fact, makes it possible to transition to another way of life, in which civilization will harmoniously interact with the biosphere, and many problems will be solved. Therefore, if there is a limiter, a biospherically acceptable structure of land use in the region, which has a physical geographical peculiarity, then further, a working out of a biospheric environmental policy of the state is required. That is, where to plant forests, where to create water protection zones, where to create nature reserves and sanctuaries, where anytime visits of people and economic activities in nature are acceptable. Thereafter, the infrastructure system should be linked to the proposed land use structure, and in one way or another, settlements, industrial enterprises, objects of scientific activity, objects of the system of education should be tied to infrastructures. And this whole thing should be developed in line with the working out of an infrastructural demographic policy of the state, which in turn should be subordinated to the biospheric ecological policy. And then this whole thing requires some economic support. And this poses the question of the working out of an economic policy, developing sectors of production, positioning enterprises in certain places, and providing them with professional cadres. And then, the real economic activity, in one form or another, will differ from the plans to a certain extent. You won't get away from this for two reasons. The first is inaccuracies of planning, and the second is the unpredictability of scientific technological progress. Therefore, economic activity, even on a planned basis, should in some way self-regulate. And its self-regulation should be coordinated again by the state, so that the objectives of the plan are achieved on schedule or a little earlier, with the planned quality or with the quality higher than planned. And thus the cycle is enclosed. We again come to the need to analyze the state of tendencies in the biosphere and demography and start with the next cycle. So this cyclics really is necessary, so that everyone in society is well fed, dressed, everyone's everyday life is arranged, so that children receive a full-fledged education and upbringing, so that everyone is healthy, and so that the biosphere of the planet is stable. But this cyclics is incompatible with the liberal market economic model, which is based on the principle that money is the god of civilization. He who has a lot of money is the one who pleases the god. He who does not have money has no right to exist. Those who have little money should cut their coats according to their cloths and not complain. But this approach does not allow the implementation of this cyclics and leads to the suicide of civilization for one of two reasons: either the degradation of the biosphere or a war for the mutual destruction of competitors. Further on, we will engage in the consideration of the components of this cyclics, what should happen in each of the blocks, how the blocks should be linked to each other, what kind of culture is required for this, what the state should do, and how. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for your attention.